G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with episode 16 of Australia's Day of National Shame, which is the quote by Governor-General Sir Paul Hasluck, who was there on the day many years later on when he was unveiling a plaque to memorialise those who died in the bombing of Darwin. This is the book, Darwin 1942, Australia's Darkest Hour by Timothy Hall, based on the Low Royal Commission into the bombing of Darwin, which was held secret under the Australian Secrets Act for 40 years. It's a 13-page chapter, so I'd better get into it. Illustrated here by page 103 of khaki and green 1943 first edition. This chapter is titled The Looting. 24 hours after the raid, Darwin was a town without leadership and without authority. The police believed that their powers had been taken from them by the imposition of martial law, even though martial law was never proclaimed. The army had made no provision for taking over responsibility for civil order and had produced only the Provost Corps, which was disgracing itself with its thuggery. And the administrator, Charles Abbott, bemoaning the fact in writing to his superiors that all his senior bureaucrats had abandoned the ship, was heading down the road himself towards Adelaide River to supervise the loading of the old and the sick onto emergency evacuation transport. Every vacuum must be filled, and into the vacuum left in Darwin by the departure of all those who might have maintained some kind of authority stepped the Provost Corps and large elements of the Army and RAAF who were still in town. But instead of order, they brought with them lawlessness and total anarchy for 2 days. Nor did they wait for 24 hours even to begin their rampage, because the sirens had scarcely finished sounding the all clear when the looting and plundering began. It went on for weeks. Long after the town officially did go under military control on the 23rd of February, 4 days after the raid. Quote, "Here is a town," wrote Abbott, "which was damaged by enemy action on one day. It was not attacked by any other means. Yet in the days and weeks that followed, this Australian town was thoroughly and systematically stripped of its contents by other Australians." Unquote. So he's whinging and bitching to his head office that he couldn't control the area he was responsible for. Although civilians were certainly involved, it was the armed services and predominantly the army, spearheaded by the Provost Corps, which was most to blame. Soldiers and civilians alike were writing home to the south, boasting of the loot they had obtained in Darwin. To a lesser extent, the RAAF and the Navy were involved, as were officers and men of the US forces, but they never matched the wholesale plunder of the officers, non-commissioned officers, and men of the army. The self-evident explanation of how this was allowed to happen is that nobody had accepted responsibility for Darwin, and it became fair game for all the lawless elements in town to take over. I've got to say here as an aside, for an awfully long time, magistrates and judges have been giving troubled young men the option of going to jail or enlisting. This is what happens when you fill your allegedly voluntary armed forces with people who should have gone to jail and learned a few lessons the hard way. It could have been easily stopped by the army, but Major General Blake failed totally in his responsibility for controlling the men under his control. Complicated sentence. Abbott called this lack of control, quote, "appalling," unquote, but he himself was either unable or unwilling to do anything to prevent it. It was probably a combination of both. Because he was unwilling, therefore he was unable. One of his more extraordinary acts was to send a series of telegrams to his minister in Melbourne and Canberra describing conditions in the town as, quote, "back to normal," unquote, when there was hardly a business open or a house, including his own, which had not been systematically stripped bare by the looters. His only explanation for the telegrams, which John Barry, the counsel assisting the Royal Commissioner, described as, quote, untruthful and completely deceptive, unquote, was that he did not want anything about the looting, quote, to leak out, unquote. The police who remained in the town watched helplessly, believing that they were powerless to do anything. When Sergeant Bridgeland told them that the town was under martial law, he added that the police were not to attempt to carry out their duties except under military direction. When the handful of police officers who believed that Bridgeland was wrong attempted to intervene, they found themselves up against the Provost Corps, whom they were clearly unable to discipline. There were no official reports and few rumours of civilian police indulging in the looting. On one occasion, Constable Bob Darkin was on patrol with a young military policeman. The Provost Corps were never generous in sharing their booty with civilians, who was openly boasting about the camera equipment he had looted from one shop and how he'd had to go to several other shops before he could find film of the right size. He was naming other men in his unit who had been looting with him as though running through the names of the unit football team. Another time, Darkin was on patrol with Sergeant Bill McKinnon when they saw that the back door of a shop owned by a Chinese woman called Lorna Lim was open. They went cautiously inside and found a military policeman whom they knew had always been very friendly with Lorna. The shop was in chaos, with goods trampled all over the floor and the contents of drawers and boxes strewn everywhere. They asked the military policeman, a man called Stevens, who was responsible for all the destruction, and Darkin said as an aside, quote, I suppose you military police have got most of the stuff, unquote. Stevens replied frankly, quote, oh yes, we heard someone was looting the place, so we came down and everyone just took what they wanted, unquote. The catchline was that before Lorna Lim had fled south, she had handed Stevens the key of the store and asked him to do everything that he could to protect her goods. He had given her his word that he would. The looting was carried out on such a systematic scale that the Provost Corps went to shops and business premises not on foot but with trucks, loading up materials, foodstuffs and any other goods that took their fancy. They walked into private houses and stripped them bare. During the first 2 days after the raid, there were sometimes as many as 200 servicemen, not all of them military police, bracket, although the Provost Corps reserved the pickings for itself, close bracket, busily involved in thieving. On the afternoon of the raid, a group of Provost soldiers ransacked the freight office of Qantas at the Darwin Hotel, and while they carried out their spoils, one of the soldiers held the Qantas traffic staff at bay with a broken bottle to ensure that the others were not interrupted while they worked. Many servicemen took their loot straight down to the harbour and found a ship that was due to sail out of the battle area. For a small price, they sent to their friends and families in the south tons of household possessions belonging to people and families who had left Darwin, believing that the army and the police would be safeguarding their property. It was not just furniture and appliances which were sent, but clothes, pianos, ornaments and even children's toys. Sisters and nurses went out to the military hospital and worked day and night caring for the injured, only to get home in the evening to find that all their belongings had been stolen. It was in this way that Bruce Ackland, the DCA radio operator, who stayed by his set all through the subsequent raids, found that his home had been rifled while he was away, and most of the post and telegraph staff who worked day and night to restore and maintain essential services suffered the same fate. Even Government House, which had been a well-furnished home when Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, left it to run away, was stripped almost bare. In fact, in the brief period between Abbott returning from Adelaide River and departing again for Alice Springs, there occurred the only recorded occasion when he formally complained to the army about the looting. He had discovered that the looters had raided Government House and stolen 24 electric fans. He was so incensed that he drove straight down to the military police camp and, in the presence of the Deputy Assistant Provost Marshal, angrily upbraided the officer in charge of the Provost Corps. Captain Coleman, for the lack of discipline in the town, and particularly for the looting of his own house. He followed up this visit with a memorandum to the commanding officers of all three services, as well as the senior American officer, demanding that they conduct a parade followed by a minute search of their camps until the missing fans were found. Finally, he demanded that a round-the-clock guard be posted on his house to prevent it happening again. If any of the senior officers took him seriously, there was no visible sign of it, except from the Provost Corps, who said they had established that their men had never looted anything. Abbott was refused a guard, which might have saved a valuable Bechstein piano belonging to his wife, which later disappeared with the rest of his furniture. Soon after the administrator left for Adelaide River, Edgar Harrison, the permanent civil defence officer, found a group of American soldiers walking nonchalantly out of Abbott's house with their arms full of clothing and other articles. He ordered them to take them back, which surprisingly they did. But the next day Harrison went back to his own house and found 2 Australian Army officers there, a major and a captain. Without realising who Harrison was, the major remarked that he was just looking around to see if there was anything of value, while the captain said that he particularly wanted a kerosene fridge. When Harrison told them that it was his own home, they mumbled something about being sorry and hurried out of the house. Harrison immediately wrote a report to Abbott, which a junior officer who was with him witnessed, and ensured that it reached the administrator as soon as he returned to Darwin. He never even received an acknowledgement. Citizens who had been evacuated either by compulsion, the forced evacuation was underway when the raid happened, had been assured that their houses and property would be safeguarded for as long as that was physically possible. The intention was that they would be protected until the Japanese either wiped out or occupied Darwin, not until the Australian Armed Services were let loose to loot it. Mrs. Felix Spain, who had been compulsorily evacuated, wrote back to the government secretary in Darwin after the raid, asking if someone could send down her clothing and a few personal possessions which she badly needed. In fact, the letter was given to Judge Wells, and when he went round to Mrs. Spain's house with a police constable, they found that, like almost every other house in Darwin by that time, it had been looted from end to end. There was a considerable amount of women's clothing in the house, but it had been thrown all over the floor and trampled on. It was ripped and filthy. The judge wrote an apologetic letter to Mrs. Spain, in which he said bluntly, quote, "It might be possible to salvage some of it if facilities were available, but even if this were done and we forward it over the convoys, which is the only method of getting anything out, it would probably be looted again en route." Going hand in hand with the looting was the kind of senseless destruction that was committed in Lorna Lim's store, as well as at the general store of another Chinese man, Charlie On, which was so systematically looted and vandalised that not a single item remained that had not been torn or broken or senselessly emptied out of its container. The librarian at the Darwin Library, Mr. Selman, went to the library immediately after the raid and to his joy found that 20,000 books were undamaged. 2 weeks later he returned again after going south and found the library completely gutted, with books, papers and filing cards strewn all over the building, most of them ripped and walked on in what he described as indescribable confusion. Florence Bleezer owned the store in Darwin but was well known throughout Australia for his unique collection of botanical specimens from the Northern Territory, which he had devoted his lifetime to assembling. He was compulsorily evacuated and his carefully annotated specimens, books, photographic slides and records were thrown out of his home by looters and torn up, smashed or trodden underfoot. In one day, 50 years of careful and devoted work was destroyed. When Florence Bleezer was told of the news, he was so shocked that he died from a heart attack. A great deal of the trouble with the Provost Corps, initially at least, was caused by drink. The first thing to be looted from the hotels. On the night of the raid, there were drunken gangs roaming the town, looting and fighting among themselves almost until dawn. Provost Corps pickets were belatedly posted outside the hotels at midnight to prevent any more stealing of alcohol, but by then there was not much left. And putting the military police there was like putting a child molester on duty in a kindergarten. Driving back to naval headquarters in town from Area Command headquarters at the RAAF station, Lieutenant Commander McManus, the Navy's intelligence chief in Darwin, almost ran over Sergeant Major MacArthur Onslow, who was weaving drunkenly all over the road, still shooting out the lights of approaching cars. McManus had been warned, however, and had switched off his lights in time. He had also been told that MacArthur Onslow had enough spirits from the nearby hotel to keep him drunk until well into the foreseeable future. Harry Hawke of the Postal Department was so busy maintaining the service that he was eating, living and sleeping in his office. He got home one evening to find 3 soldiers sitting on the veranda surrounded by empty bottles of beer which they had clearly drunk themselves. At first he thought they were a military guard who'd been posted there at the post office, but when he asked them if that was what they were doing, they told him they had no idea. Quote, "We're just 3 chaps," they told him, "who came in to have a drink," unquote. They insolently refused to move for several hours, but told him before they went that they had taken the drink from the Victoria Hotel. One of the worst buildings to suffer from looting was the Darwin Hotel, a modern hotel that had only recently been provided with new furniture and equipment. The staff, including the manager, were evacuated in spite of asking if they could leave a skeleton staff or even the manager on his own to safeguard their property. This was refused. When the details of the looting began to reach the head office of the company which owned the hotel, it again asked for permission to send someone to Darwin, and again this was refused by Major General Blake. It then asked for a military guard to be placed on the building, and this too was denied on the grounds that it was a civilian matter. Meanwhile, the hotel was systematically gutted, mainly by army personnel, and the beds, furniture, linen, crockery and even the carpets were taken. The company asked the Guinea Airways operations manager, Eric Quisling, to inspect the hotel for them and send them a first-hand report of what was happening there. He wrote back that it was almost bare and that, quote, "A direct result of the neglect by the army to look after it is that certain regiments of all the services have availed themselves of the opportunity of helping themselves to a great amount of furniture," unquote. Quisling made private inquiries to try to establish where it had gone and found that the bedroom furniture and the lounge chairs had been mostly taken by the RAAF and were being used by the officers, while the army had taken the linen which had then, quote, "disappeared," unquote, and was assumed to have been sent south by ship. The requisitioning of property by the services and the ARP, usually without any legal right, added considerably to the confusion later when the huge number of claims for compensation poured in. Some goods, particularly motor vehicles, were required, but more often than not, quote, "impressing," unquote, goods was nothing more than a euphemism for taking whatever was wanted. An audit report later said that the RAAF were particularly at fault in commandeering almost anything they wanted without proper authority and usually without any evidence that the goods had ever actually been used by the Air Force. There was never any statutory authority for this impressment, and senior ARP wardens, for example, simply handed a hastily concocted note to anyone who grumbled at being parted from their property. It read, quote, "You are hereby notified that the goods, details of which appear below, have been impressed for service by the Northern Territory Administration," unquote. One of the most prominent civil defence officers in the period immediately after the raid was found to have stolen a watch and other property in this way and was only ordered to repay the value of the goods he had stolen, to the annoyance of Abbot, who wrote a complaining letter to the minister that he thought the man in question had got off too lightly. Eric Quisling had completed his inspection of the hotel and was on the point of driving away when he noticed an army truck drawing up outside the hotel. He saw a sergeant and a corporal get out and go into the hotel, and he quickly followed them. By the time he got to the desk, they were already at work removing an expensive pump which operated the hotel's entire sanitary system. Quisling walked straight to them and demanded to know what authority they had to be taking it. They said they had none, but were simply obeying an officer's instructions. At Quisling's insistence, they left. Almost a month after the raid, by which time the military were officially in complete control of the town, the company wrote yet again demanding proper protection of their property. This time Blake wrote back stating that the protection of property was a civilian matter for the civilian police, even though he failed to mention that the civilian police had then been taken over by his own provost corps. More incredibly, unless he was naive enough to think that what was happening in Darwin was not known outside the town, Blake added that he had not heard of a single report of looting taking place. Such a senseless lie infuriated the company, whose secretary wrote back a surprisingly restrained letter in which he said, quote, "It is difficult to understand how it could be seriously suggested in an official communication that the responsibility for protecting private property rests on the administration and the civil police when the military knows perfectly well that these organisations no longer function in Darwin. And it is also ridiculous to say on the 17th of March that you have no knowledge of looting taking place in Darwin when extensive looting has already taken place and was going on at the very time your letter was written," unquote. He could have added, had he known, that the first of Major General Blake's soldiers had already been convicted and jailed by the stipendiary magistrate for looting. Probably only 12 people were prosecuted for looting, out of 200 going at any one time. And then almost invariably because of pressure by such officials as Judge Wells. He himself sentenced some looters, including a major who was imprisoned for 12 months. It would have been serious enough if the people who indulged in this looting had taken the stuff for their own use, but this was far from the case. Even while the Royal Commission was actually sitting in Darwin in early March, soldiers were openly taking refrigerators, radios, sewing machines and clothing down to the wharf and selling them to seamen on the merchant ships in exchange for cash, cigarettes or tobacco. 20 members of the crew of one ship was arrested when it reached Brisbane and were charged with possessing property belonging to former Darwin residents. Bracket, this was the usual charge in Darwin as well, because unless a person had been caught red-handed, it was easier to prove than stealing. Close bracket. But there was insufficient evidence, it was claimed, to take any action against those in Darwin who had sold the goods. What effect it would have had on reducing the looting and general lawlessness if the Civil Defence Organisation had been functioning and if the police had not believed that they had been stripped of their powers is only conjecture. Police Sergeant William McKinnon had no doubt that the civilian police would at least have protected civilians against the military police when they were systematically looting the town, and that a properly established ARP organisation working with the police would certainly have prevented the situation from getting out of hand. McKinnon was openly contemptuous of the role played by the military, whom he dismissed as being, quote, incompetent to do their job, laggard in advising the methods needed to meet the situation, and bungling in the way they had handled the situation that developed, unquote. The looting and the traffic in stolen goods, which went on for months afterwards, was so blatant and the attitude of officials so particular officials, particularly in the army, towards civilians who complained about the lack of protection given to their property, was so cavalier that it is extraordinary that it never became a major public issue. That it didn't was largely due, of course, to the fact that an almost blanket censorship was imposed on the press and on radio of almost any information about Darwin. Enough did filter through for people with access to someone still in the town to be gravely concerned, but it was not enough to stir public opinion at a time when official information services were playing down the whole issue of the raid on Darwin. "Bah!" said the sheeple. Casualties were given as 15 killed, including 4 women, and the losses to shipping were said to be comparatively small. There were many people in Darwin who were prepared to go along with this story, believing that it would save their families and friends unnecessary worry. But once that degree of censorship had been fixed, it was a simple matter to start proscribing any other information that might prove embarrassing to the public interest, which invariably meant embarrassment to the armed services. Other rumours were deliberately and officially fostered, including the quite false story that the Japanese aircraft had been disguised with American markings. and that they had singled out the hospitals for bomb attacks. In spite of the fact that almost all senior officers who witnessed the attack believed that the Japanese had by and large deliberately left hospitals alone. Overseas there was little concern with protecting Australians from learning the truth of what had happened and what was continuing to happen in their northern port. Many Americans had died, particularly on the destroyer Peary, and the American press was not going to be silenced. Inevitably, garbled versions of these reports began to circulate in Australia, and the amount of damage began to escalate in people's conversation to something far higher than even the truth. That's why the budgie smuggling wingnut's going to come unglued with trying to keep a censorship lid on the war he's brewing with Indonesia. The Indonesians are not playing ball with his censorship. The number of killed, for example, was being reported as being in excess of 1,200. There are still those who were in Darwin during the raids who insist that 1,000 was nearer the true figure, although official reports, even those intended for cabinet only, have always denied this, and the official figure is 243, close bracket. Then the rumours about the looting began to receive wide attention, especially when the occasional court report described how individuals had amassed a treasure trove of goods. So widespread did these rumours become that Prime Minister John Curtin was forced to issue a second statement saying that what he had said after the raids had been the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Quote, "Nothing had been hidden," unquote, he promised. "There is no ground for rumour. If rumours circulate, take no notice of them and deal sharply with the person who circulates them. The government has told you the truth," unquote. Back in Darwin, the release of this lie only added to the military's belief that it could do almost anything it liked without fear of the truth resulting in a public outcry. Looting was also made easier for the military police after the weekend that followed the raid, because by then there were fewer than 500 civilians left in town, and almost all these were shipwrecked sailors, most of them from the merchant ships that were caught in the harbour. They had no personal involvement in the goods that were stolen or the homes that were being ransacked. There was one incident that was widely reported in Darwin at the time, to the delight of almost everybody. When Mr. Justice Lowe was making his progress round the town, he visited Government House and found all the signs that a party had been in full swing when the raid began, or, as the judge preferred to believe, on the evening before. There were bottles opened, some still with wine in them, and glasses lying around, and outside on the veranda there was more wine and a bottle of bitters. The irony of it was that the evidence which was left behind so clearly pointed to Abbott being implicated that, coming on top of everything else, the Royal Commission hardly concealed its suspicion that he was lying again. In fact, on this occasion, he was entirely innocent. It never seemed to occur to anyone that the offender was a looter, with preference for good wine instead of stolen beer, though why it would have been an offence if Abbott had been throwing a party was never explained by the Commissioner. What had actually happened was that a sergeant working in administration, who had been a major in the British Army during the First World War, bracket, when he had won the Military Cross, close bracket, had gone into town on the night of the raid with two other sergeants, intending to pay a call on the administrator's house. It would not be true to say that they intended to actually pay a call on the administrator, whom they knew was now staying with the General, but simply on his house. There was a risk that they might be stopped on the way through the gate by a guard, but they overcame this by explaining to the officer in charge of a picket nearby that they were visiting the administrator at his invitation, but were afraid that a jittery guard might shoot them as they went into the grounds. The officer fully understood and escorted them safely into Government House gardens, where he wished them a good meal and left them. That was exactly what the three men intended to have, and as soon as they were inside the house, which they entered through an unlocked door, they began their preparations. They drew the blinds to observe the blackout regulations and carefully laid the long mahogany table for three, using the best silver and china they could find. Then from Abbott's fridge they selected chicken, cold meats and a salad. Finally, from the cellar they brought a selection of the administrator's best wines. Unhurriedly they sat down at the table, and with sparkling conversation to enliven the meal, they dined in splendid formality. They sampled a selection of the wines until they were agreeably mellow, and then solemnly stood to drink the loyal toast to the king. The last thing they did before they went home was to wash up and carefully put away the plates and cutlery back where they had found them. Only the glasses and the remains of the wine were left to tantalise whoever came in the next day. The story would probably have gone the way of 1,000 other tall tales and been quickly forgotten except for one thing. When the administrator went into the house the following morning, he did not notice the bottles and glasses, but what did catch his eye was a brooch of miniature medals of the kind worn on formal occasions. And the first of the medals was a military cross, awarded only to officers and warrant officers for gallantry. When he was next at the barracks, he handed the medals to the administrative sergeant, an elderly man who seemed to be laughing at him, and who promised that the medals would be returned to their owner without delay. So, here endeth chapter 16. Next up will be Who Needs Civil Defence? Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Australia's Day of National Shame. Abbot is the Australian equivalent of Quisling. Biggest fuckwit in Norway in the whole of the Second World War. Biggest fuckwit in Australia in the whole of the Second World War. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.